"I'm going to save your ranch," said the woman in the worn-out boots. Wade Coleman laughed so hard the whiskey sloshed in his glass. "If you save this land, I'll give you half of it." He had no idea he'd just made a bet with the wrong person. His laughter rolled across the porch, down the wooden steps, and ran loose across the cracked dirt yard. The ranch hands carrying empty feed sacks near the corral stopped to look. Even the skinny cattle lifted their heads. The woman didn't laugh. She just stood there, dust climbing up her boots, a battered backpack on her shoulder, and a leather-bound notebook pressed against her chest. She waited for the laughter to die down on its own. Half the ranch. "You hear that, Frank?" Wade said, wiping a tear from the corner of his eye. "The lady here walks up asking for water and already wants to be my business partner." Frank Delgado, the foreman, shook his head, embarrassed. He knew his boss. He knew that laugh was the laugh of a man going under. And a man going under laughs louder than anybody. Because the truth was, Lucky Star Ranch was dying, and everybody in that stretch of West Texas knew it. 3 years of drought had eaten the pasture down to the roots. The main stock pond had turned into a cracked clay dish where buzzards landed to rest. Of the 400 head of cattle Wade inherited from his father, fewer than 80 were left. And those 80 looked like leather stretched over bone. The ranch's name had become a joke in town. Lucky Star. Down at the feed store in Sundown, when somebody wanted to say a deal had gone bad, they'd say it was Wade Coleman luck. And he knew it. That's why he drank on the porch at 10 in the morning. That's why he laughed like that. The woman stepped forward. "My name is Grace Whitfield. I walked here from the highway because the bus doesn't run this road anymore. I asked for water because I'm thirsty. But I looked at your land while I was walking. I looked close. I'm telling you, I can save this ranch." "With what?" Wade spread his arms. "That little notebook there? Gonna pray for rain?" "It's not going to rain," Grace said. "Not this year. Maybe not next year either." The laughter on the porch stopped. That the ranch hands hadn't expected. Every drifter who showed up around here selling hope started out promising rain. "So how exactly do you plan on saving anything, Miss Whitfield? The water this land needs isn't up in the sky. It's under your feet." Wade came down 2 steps from the porch, glass still in hand. Up close, he was a good-looking man for his age. Silver hair pushed back, a leather vest over a wrinkled shirt. Handsome and worn out, the way men get when they've spent the whole life never hearing the word no. "Under my feet," he repeated slowly, savoring it. "My grandfather drilled this land. My daddy drilled this land. I drilled this land. 3 generations of dry holes. Down there, it's nothing but rock and disappointment." "They drilled in the wrong spot. And you know the right spot." "Not yet. But I know how to look." Wade glanced at Frank, glanced at the hands standing by the corral, glanced at Mabel the cook, who had come to the kitchen doorway wiping her hands on her apron. He had an audience, and a man like Wade, once he's got an audience, can't stop. "Knows how to look," he said, climbing back onto the porch like a man stepping onto a stage. "The lady shows up here with the clothes on her back, no car, no name, nothing. And she knows what 3 generations of ranchers never figured out. Knows more than the engineers I paid good money for. Knows more than the co-op boys, more than the bank folks, more than everybody." "Maybe," Grace said. "Maybe," he mimicked, sharp mocking. A couple of hands laughed. "Well, then let's make it official, since the lady likes to bet." He snapped his fingers at Mabel. Bring paper and a pen. Go on." Mabel hesitated, looking from one to the other. Then she went in and came back with whatever she could find, a piece of brown butcher paper from the meat counter and a pen that skipped. Wade set the paper on the porch railing and wrote, in big, crooked letters, the kind of handwriting a man does while laughing. Then he read it out loud for the whole yard to hear. I, Wade Coleman, owner of Lucky Star Ranch, promise half of this property to Miss Grace Whitfield should she find water on this land and save this ranch from ruin. He paused for effect. Signed, Wade Coleman. In front of all these starving witnesses. The hands laughed again. Frank didn't. Wade signed with a flourish, turned the paper around, and held out the pen to Grace. Sign it, Doctor of Underground Water. Let's make this partnership official. She was supposed to back down. That was the whole joke. She was supposed to turn red, mumble an excuse, and walk back down the same dusty road she came in on. And then he'd have a story to tell at the bar for months. Grace set her backpack on the ground, tucked the leather notebook under her arm, took the pen, and signed her full name, round and steady, without a shake. "I'm going to need a place to sleep," she said, handing the pen back. "I'll eat and work alongside the rest of your crew. I don't want a paycheck. If I fail, I'll leave and you'll have one more story to tell. If I'm right, that paper's worth something." Wade's smile shrank by an inch. Just an inch. It was the first time in a long while that somebody hadn't done what he expected. "Mabel," he said, not taking his eyes off Grace, "fix the lady a spot in the bunkhouse and put that paper in the china cabinet someplace safe. In a few weeks, I'm going to want to read it out loud again." He went back up, grabbed the bottle, and walked inside, still laughing. But now there was a thread of something else woven into that laugh. Something small and uncomfortable he couldn't quite name. What Wade Coleman didn't know yet was that piece of brown butcher paper signed in mockery on a hot morning was about to become the most important document of his life, and that the woman in the worn-out boots standing in his yard carried more knowledge about water tucked inside that leather notebook than the whole region put together. Mabel walked Grace across the yard to the bunkhouse, a long, tin-roofed building next to the corral. Along the way, the cook kept glancing sideways at the new arrival. "You shouldn't have signed that," she said finally, quietly. "He's going to make your life hell till you quit. That's his way. Humiliates folks till they leave. Then he tells the whole town how weak they were." "I know, Mrs. Mabel." "You know, and you signed anyway? I've been humiliated by people a lot worse than him." Rich folks, ranch owners, at least he humiliates you to your face. Others do it on paper. Mabel stopped walking, looked at the woman properly for the first time. The boots were worn, but good thick leather, the kind that's walked plenty of hard ground. The hands had calluses, but the nails were kept neat. And the way she talked wasn't the way of somebody begging for a place to sleep on the road. "Who are you, really?" Grace looked out at the yard, the dead pond in the distance, the rusted windmill standing still in the middle of the yellow pasture, pointing at nothing. "For now, I'm just a woman who's thirsty," she said. "I'll tell you the rest when the land lets me." That first night, lying on the narrow bunkhouse cot, listening to the hands snore on the other side of the thin wall, Grace lit a stub of candle and opened the leather notebook. The pages were yellowed, filled with small, tight handwriting that wasn't hers. Sketches of hills, arrows, plant names, marks that looked like maps and marks that looked like prayers. On the first page, in bigger letters, a line written decades ago by a hand that no longer existed. "The land talks. Folks just forgot how to listen." Grace ran her finger slowly over the words, the way she did every night for a long time now. Then she blew out the candle. Outside, the whole ranch was silent. But underneath that silence, deep in the dark of the rock, something ancient was waiting for her. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, the hands found the new woman already standing in the middle of the dry pasture. She wasn't drilling anything. She wasn't praying. She was crouched down, looking at an anthill. "Lose something, ma'am?" one of them asked, a young hand named Danny, trying not to laugh. "Found something," she answered without looking up. "Found what?" "Ants, carrying damp clay in their bellies." Grace stood, brushed the dust off her knees, and jotted something down. "Ants don't dig deep for nothing, kid. Nobody in this world digs deep for nothing." She kept walking through the pasture, stopping here, stopping there, and Danny watched that figure get smaller against the rising sun. Not sure whether to tell the others or just keep to himself the strange feeling that something on that dead ranch had just started to stir. In the first few days, nobody took Grace seriously, and she didn't try to make them. She got up before everyone, walked the whole ranch on foot, end to end, a borrowed machete on her hip. She'd come back at lunchtime, covered in dust, eat quietly in the corner of the kitchen, and head back out. She didn't drill a single hole, didn't ask for a machine, didn't mention water once. "See that?" Wade would say on the porch to whoever would listen. "The doctor's on vacation. Any day now she'll hitch a ride to the highway and disappear. I'll bet a bottle on it." But the hands working scattered across the ranch started noticing things. They noticed the woman tasted the dirt. She'd take a handful of soil, rub it between her fingers, smell it, and sometimes touch it to the tip of her tongue, like tasting for salt. They noticed she spent too long looking at trees nobody ever looked at, the crooked mesquite by the old fence, the 3 cottonwoods out back, the one hackberry that stubbornly stayed green in a corner where everything else had died. They noticed she'd tap the handle of the machete against the rocks and listen, ear pressed to the warm stone, eyes closed like a doctor listening to a sick man's chest. "She's crazy," Danny declared at supper. "Crazy don't walk like that," said Frank, who was the oldest and had seen more of the world. "Crazy walks lost. She walks like somebody looking for something she already knows is there." On the 4th day, Grace showed up in the kitchen before breakfast and stood watching Mabel draw water from the small cistern that supplied the house. It was the only spot on the whole ranch that still gave up any water at all, a thin, muddy trickle that filled 2 buckets a day and no more. "Has that cistern always been this weak?" Mabel sighed. "Used to be good. Back in old man Coleman's time, it filled buckets that never ran dry. Slowed down, little by little. Been crying like that about 12 years now." "Slowed down gradually or all at once?" "Gradual, like somebody losing heart." Grace crouched at the edge, looked down into the dark bottom, dropped a small pebble and listened to the sound. Then she spent long minutes sketching something. "Mrs. Mabel, can I borrow that rope and that leaky bucket you were going to throw out?" She spent the whole morning inside the cistern, climbing down on the rope with a lantern, scraping the walls, hauling up buckets of sludge, measuring by hand. When she came out, covered in mud head to toe, she had a small smile at the corner of her mouth, the first one since she'd arrived. "What is it?" Mabel asked. "Your cistern isn't dying of drought. It's dying of a clog. There's a vein of water down there still pulsing. Weak, but pulsing. It's coming from that direction." Grace pointed toward the rise, toward the low, rocky hills at the far end of the ranch. "And a weak vein down here, Mrs. Mabel is usually the child of a bigger vein somewhere else." "So what are you going to do?" "First, I'm going to unclog your cistern. A ranch gets saved starting in the kitchen." She worked on it for 2 days with Danny's embarrassed help. He showed up saying it was only because he had no other work. They cleared the bottom, pulled out rock, rebuilt the stone lining the old way with proper stacking, and dug a covered channel Grace called a drain. On the 3rd morning, Mabel lowered the bucket, unsure. It sank. Really sank, with that heavy, wet sound she hadn't heard in years. When she pulled it up, it came up full to the brim, and the water was clear. The cook stood there a while, holding the bucket, her chin trembling. "Lord have mercy," she said quietly. "Lord have mercy, girl." On a small ranch, news travels faster than a horse. By lunchtime, every hand had already gone to peek at the cistern one by one, like visiting a shrine. They drew water just to look, laughed for no reason. Danny told the story of the cleanup, adding new details with every telling. Wade was the last to show up. He arrived after lunch with the walk of a man about to disprove a lie. Looked into the cistern, had them lower the bucket, watched it come up full, stood quiet a long moment. "Cistern water," he said, finally, shrugging. "Kitchen water. This doesn't water a pasture, doesn't fill a pond, doesn't pay a debt. This doesn't save anything. Doesn't save anything, Grace agreed, calm. This was just the land saying good morning. Wade looked at her. She held his gaze, and again that small, uncomfortable something stirred in him. The thread of doubt he drowned every day in porch whiskey. Tell you what, Doctor, let me know when the land says good afternoon. And he walked off. But this time, nobody laughed along with him. That night in the kitchen, while Grace ate supper, Mabel sat across from her with 2 cups of coffee and the look of someone who wasn't getting up without an answer. "Where'd you learn all this?" Grace stirred her coffee slowly. "My daddy was a well-witcher, one of the old traveling kind. Rode all over the dry country with a bedroll and this notebook finding water where everybody else only found rock. Folks called him Water Sam. Said he could hear the land." She smiled a little. "It wasn't hearing, Mrs. Mabel. It was studying. He'd look at plants, look at ants, look at the color of the rock, the way a hill folds. 50 years of watching becomes science, too." "And you learned from him?" "I learned from him first. Then I learned from books. I went to college, Mrs. Mabel, studied hard, went to the state university, got my master's degree, became somebody with a badge on her chest." Her voice changed color, darkened a shade. "Spent 15 years finding water for big companies. Irrigation projects dams deep wells. Had an office with my name on the door." Mabel looked at the worn boots on her feet, the faded clothes, the thin backpack hanging on the nail. "And what happened?" Grace finished her coffee, closed her hand around the empty cup. "What happened is I trusted somebody I shouldn't have, and I signed something I didn't read." "Signed what?" "A sentence. My own." She rinsed the cup in the fresh cistern water and stood a second, watching the stream run over her fingers. "The rest I'll tell you another day. Tonight I still want to check something up on the ridge before dark." Mabel stayed in the kitchen alone with more questions than she'd started with, and it was there, drying that second cup, that the old cook understood something the others would take a while longer to figure out. That woman hadn't ended up there by accident. Somebody with all that knowledge doesn't walk across a drought-stricken county on foot, asking to sleep in a stranger's bunkhouse, unless she's running from something or looking for something. Or both. Up on the ridge in the distance, Grace's small figure climbed among the rocks at the back of the ranch, stopping rock to rock, tapping, listening. The sun went down red behind her. She stopped at a big slab half buried at a spot where the ridge made a strange fold, like a hunched shoulder. She tapped it with the machete handle. The sound came back. Different. Less dry. Deeper. A sound with a basement. Grace crouched, slowly pressed her ear to the still warm rock, closed her eyes, and smiled. She opened the leather notebook in the last of the light. She found an old page where her father's small handwriting said, "Ridge that folds its shoulder holds the water in its armpit." And she wrote underneath it in her own steady hand, "He was right. She's here. Just need to know how big." What Grace didn't know yet, that late afternoon on the ridge, was that somebody else already knew the size. Had known it for a long time, with paperwork numbers and an official stamp. And that person was at that very moment in an air-conditioned office in the city, tying up the last details of a plan to take that land before anybody found out what it was really worth. The following Saturday, same as every Saturday. Wade rode into sundown for the farmer's market, more out of habit than need. And this time he brought a fresh audience for the old joke. "Where's the water doctor, Wade?" the feed store owner hollered from behind the counter. "Heard you got yourself a psychic out at the ranch." "Psychic, no, sir," Wade answered, playing to the crowd leaning on the counter. "Business partner. Signed a contract and everything. Butcher paper, but notarized by the laughter of witnesses." A wave of laughter rolled through the store. He told the story, dressing it up with details: the woman walking up on foot, the little notebook, the maybe, the signature without a shake. Sundown was small and hungry for gossip. In one afternoon, the most broke-down ranch in the county had, on top of the drought and the debt, a tourist attraction. "And the cistern?" somebody asked from the back. "Heard she found water in the kitchen, unclogged some old hole." Wade shrugged. "Any well digger can do that. I'd like to see her find real water. My land's already eaten the money of 3 drilling companies. If there was water down there, I'd be the first to know." In the back of the store, without Wade noticing, a thin man in a ball cap sipped a soda and listened with more attention than a stranger passing through should have. When Wade left, the man paid, walked to the payphone by the square, and made a short call to the city. On the other end of the line, in an air-conditioned office, Nathaniel Cross listened to the report, thanked the caller, and hung up. Then he sat a while, spinning a pen between his fingers, looking out the window. "A woman with a notebook," he repeated quietly to himself. "Unclogging a cistern." He gave a short laugh and went back to his paperwork. But that same afternoon, without quite knowing why, he moved up by 2 weeks the visit he'd planned to pay to Lucky Star Ranch. Meanwhile, Grace lived through her hardest days not because of the others, because of herself. Reading the land, that she could do in her sleep. Everything else was harder. The body aching from sleeping on a cot with a draft, the hands cracking hair stiff with dust, and especially at night. Daytime had work, and work is merciful. Nighttime had the tin roof and the memory. Some nights she woke in the dark of the bunkhouse with her heart pounding, dreaming the same scene every time. Dr. Voss's office, the stack of papers, the pen, the smooth voice saying, "Trust me." In the dream, she always caught it in time, always stopped her hand an inch from the paper, and woke with her fist clenched around the sheet, knowing that in real life the hand had come down. On those nights, she'd light the candle stub and open the leather notebook to any page at random, like opening a sacred book, looking for guidance. One night, she landed on a page she didn't remember reading. Her father's handwriting shakier than usual from some year of sickness or exhaustion. "A well that caves in you don't fix by yelling at the hole. You brace it, you clean it, and you dig again. The land doesn't hold a grudge. People do." Grace read it 3 times. Then she blew out the candle and, for the first time in many weeks, slept until the rooster crowed. The hand slowly warmed up to her, first out of curiosity, then out of respect, then out of something none of them could have named, which was simply affection. Danny became her shadow, asking the name of every plant, every rock. Frank, more guarded, was won over the day Grace looked at a pregnant heifer and told the vet on her own that the animal was going to have trouble calving because of the narrowness of her hips, and the animal did. And Grace helped fix its sleeve rolled up to the shoulder. "Where'd you learn about cattle?" Frank asked afterward, washing his arms next to her. "Project ranches have cattle too, Mr. Frank. And I never was one to just stand in a corner watching." Only Wade didn't change, or pretended not to. He kept up the little jabs at coffee time. "So, doctor, the land send word yet?" The laugh pulling for the hands to join in, but the hands didn't join in anymore, not really, and the laugh of a boss laughing alone is a thing that wilts fast. Mabel noticed what he himself didn't. Wade needled Grace the way a boy needles the thing he's afraid of, because the presence of that quiet, capable woman walking his ranch like somebody who could see things he'd never seen was a walking accusation. Every discovery of hers said, without saying it, "It was here the whole time and you never saw it." And a man like Wade would rather laugh than hear that. One afternoon, Mabel leaned in next to him on the porch with the closeness of her many years in that house. "Wade, I'm going to tell you something your mama would tell you if she were alive. Here it comes. That woman could be your ruin or your salvation, and the difference between the two ain't in her, it's in you. It's in the day you're going to have to choose between being right and having a future." Wade grumbled, cracked a joke, changed the subject. But that night in bed, the words kept turning over. Being right, or having a future he'd spent his whole life choosing to be right. He looked out the window at the dead pasture under the moon and did the math on what being right had gotten him. The math came out to dust. The truck showed up on a dusty Wednesday, shining so bright it looked wet. A big black pickup, the kind that costs more than a house, rolled through Lucky Star's gate, slow, like somebody who already owns the place. Out stepped a man in a starched white shirt, new boots without a scuff, and a smile that arrived before the rest of him. Behind him, a young man in glasses carrying a leather folder. "Wade, buddy!" The man threw his arms open in the middle of the yard. "Man, I've missed this ranch, missed this country air." Wade came down off the porch with a tight smile. "Nathaniel, didn't know you were coming today." "Friend, I don't call ahead. Friends just show up." Nathaniel Cross. Everybody in the county knew the name. City businessman, land buyer, feed store owner, partner to important people. In recent years, he'd bought up half a dozen ranches broken by the drought, always with the same pitch. The friend who shows up in hard times, always paying the price of a man doing you a favor. Mabel, from the kitchen window, spit discreetly onto the ground. Grace, coming back from the ridge, slowed her steps and watched from a distance. The two men sat on the porch. The young man in glasses opened the folder. Mabel brought coffee and took as long as she could arranging the tray. "Wade," Nathaniel started in that smooth tone of a man consoling a widow. "I'm gonna be straight with you because I think a lot of you. I was at the bank this week. Talked to Otis. You know I've got some pull there." Wade's face hardened. "My debt's my business." "My friend, a small debt is the debtor's business. A debt your size is the whole county's business." Nathaniel sipped his coffee unhurried. 3 years of missed payments, interest on interest. Otis showed me the number, Wade. You want me to say it out loud here on your porch? Or you'd rather just take my word for it? Wade didn't answer. His hand reached for a glass that wasn't there. "The bank's gonna foreclose," Nathaniel went on, matter of weeks. "They'll take the ranch, put it up for auction, and you know what happens at a dried-out land auction. It'll go for the price of the fence posts. You'll walk away with no land and still owing money. And that's where I come in." Nathaniel's voice held steady. "I come in as a friend. I've got a written offer, cash right now, pays off your whole bank debt, and leaves enough for you to start over in town with your head held high. Sign today, sleep debt-free tonight." The young man in glasses slid a paper across the table. Wade looked at the number, and even braced for little felt his stomach drop. "That's a third of what this ranch is worth. That's double what it's worth today, my friend. A ranch is worth what it produces. Yours produces dust." Nathaniel opened his hands, patient, almost fond. "I'm paying for our friendship, not for the land." That was the moment Grace climbed the porch steps. She didn't ask permission, picked up the coffee pot from the tray, poured herself a cup, like family, and sat on the bench in the corner. Nathaniel looked at her, then at Wade. "Aren't you gonna introduce me to the lady?" "She's an employee," Wade said, awkward. "I'm a partner," Grace corrected, calm, blowing on her coffee. "We've got a signed contract. Half the ranch." The silence on the porch lasted a full 3 seconds. Then Nathaniel laughed, and his laugh was worse than Wade's because there was nothing warm inside it. "A partner, how nice. And may I ask what the lady brought to this partnership, because it sure wasn't capital from the looks of it?" "Water." The word landed on the porch and just sat there waiting. "Water," Nathaniel repeated. His smile stayed put, but something in his eyes pulled back, quick, like an animal ducking for cover. Grace saw it. She'd spent 15 years in boardrooms learning to read exactly that kind of flinch. "What water, ma'am?" "This country's well known. Under this ground, it's nothing but hard rock, clear to the center of the earth. Any engineer will confirm it." "Did you send an engineer to confirm it?" Nathaniel's smile went a shade thinner. "Don't need to. I know this land like the back of my hand." "Interesting," Grace said and drank her coffee. Nathaniel turned back to Wade, and now the smooth voice had a hurry buried inside it. "Wade, I'll be honest one last time. This offer has an expiration date. My money doesn't sit around waiting on a rancher to make up his mind. You've got till the end of the month. After that, you'll be talking to the auctioneer. And an auctioneer doesn't take coffee on the porch." He stood, straightened his starched shirt, and on his way out, gripped Wade's shoulder with both hands, playing at warmth. "Think about your life, friend. Don't let some drifter with a notebook fill your head with fantasies. Dry land is dry land." The black truck pulled out, leaving a cloud of dust that took its time settling. Wade stood on the porch, looking at the offer sheet. And for the first time since Grace had arrived, there was no mockery on his face at all. Just an old, 3 generations deep tiredness. "He knows," Grace said. "Knows what? About the water, he knows." Wade rubbed his face with both hands. "Ma'am, for the love of God, the man came to buy cheap land. That's what he does for a living. Nobody knows about any water because there is no water. There's a kitchen cistern and a woman who talks pretty." "Then why did he come in such a hurry?" Grace stood and walked to the edge of the porch. "A broken ranch doesn't run off, Mr. Wade. Dry land doesn't go anywhere. Whoever's buying dead land waits for the auction and pays even less. A buyer in a hurry is a buyer who knows something the seller doesn't. I've seen it happen plenty of times up close." "Seen it where? In your drifter life?" Grace stood quiet a moment, looking at the still windmill out in the pasture. "In my life as an engineer, Mr. Wade. Water resources engineer. 15 years of career projects across half the country, specialist in groundwater and crystalline rock formations, which happens to be exactly the kind of ground this ranch sits on." Wade looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. And maybe he really was. If that's true, what's an engineer like that doing sleeping in a bunkhouse, no car, no phone, working for free on the promise of a piece of butcher paper? "Starting over," she said, and said nothing more. That night, Wade didn't drink. He stayed up late on the porch with Nathaniel's paper in one hand, and in the other, something he'd sent Mabel to fetch from the china cabinet against her wishes. The brown paper, the bet, his own crooked handwriting, promising half of everything. He read the 2 papers over and over, one against the other, under the yellow porch light. What he still didn't know, comparing those 2 papers in the hot night, was that the decision he made in the coming days wasn't worth just the ranch. It was worth a fortune he couldn't imagine, hidden in the dark of the rock. While across town, a man in a starched shirt had already decided that fortune would be his, whatever the cost. Early the next morning, Wade found Grace at the corral. "End of the month," he said without a greeting. "That's the deadline Nathaniel gave me. I'll give you the same. Show me this water by the end of the month, or I sign his paper and we each go our own way." Grace set her cup down on the tray. "I'll need men tools and that old tractor rusting dead in the barn. That tractor hasn't started in 2 years. It'll start by Friday. I've worked on machines my whole life." She walked past him, already headed for the barn, then stopped. "One more thing, Mr. Wade. When that water comes up, and it will, you're going to owe an apology. Not to me. To every single person on this ranch you ever laughed at in front of the others. And if it doesn't come up then, I'll walk out of here on foot the same way I walked in. But hear me say this." She looked toward the ridge out where it folded its shoulder. "This land isn't dead, Mr. Wade. It's trapped. There's a difference." The tractor started Friday coughing black smoke and startling the whole ranch, its noise, waking everything up like an animal coming back to life. Danny ran out of the bunkhouse, shirtless, to see. Mabel crossed herself in the kitchen doorway, laughing. Grace climbed down, wiping grease off her hands with a rag. "Clogged fuel pump, something living in the filter. A machine's like a cistern, it's almost never dead, just abandoned." From then on, Lucky Star Ranch became something else, became the drawing board. Grace sketched on the dirt with a stick for all the hands to see the map of what she'd read across the ranch in 2 weeks of walking. The ridge that folded the lines of rock running down from it like open fingers, the stubborn green patches, the old buried water path. Rain that falls up on that ridge doesn't stay on the ridge, she explained, pointing. It gets into the rock through the cracks and goes down. Down here deep, there are zones where the rock's broken up, crushed, full of fractures. Water lives in those fractures. Everybody who ever drilled this land made the mistake of drilling where it was convenient. Near the house, near the corral, near the road. Water doesn't care about convenient. Water lives where the rock lets it. And where does the rock let it? Frank asked. Grace planted the stick at a point on the drawing on the hillside in a stretch of loose rock a good 40-minute walk from the house. Here, where 2 fracture lines cross. I measured with what I've got, which is eyes, plants, ants, and 50 years of notes in this book. If I had my old equipment, I could confirm it in a day. I don't. So we'll confirm it the old way. Digging. They started Monday. Grace out front, 4 hands, the tractor hauling tools, drinking water, and tarps. They cleared the access-cleared loose rock, set up a sturdy wooden tripod, and started sinking a widened hand-dug well, taking turns with bracing and everything the old way. Wade showed up every day, stood off to the side, arms crossed, not helping and not getting in the way. But Mabel noticed he'd stopped drinking in the mornings, and that he'd quit calling Grace doctor with a smirk. Just called her doctor now. On the 4th day of digging, the dirt from the bottom started coming up dark but cold. On the 5th, damp. On the 6th, damp enough that Danny climbed out of the well shouting, holding a clump of dirt that squeezed, dripped between his fingers, and the whole ranch ran down the slope to see. There was celebration. Hats thrown in the air, Mabel crying again. That night of the 6th day, the ranch went to bed late. Mabel killed a chicken with no particular occasion and made a celebration supper. And at the long kitchen table, the hands were already dividing up water that didn't exist yet. Danny swore he was going to fill the pond to the brim and learn to swim in his old age. Frank, more restrained, figured how many head of cattle that pasture could carry once it was wet. Even Wade showed up, in the kitchen, which he never did, and took a plate, listening to his men's dreams with a strange look on his face. A man wanting to believe and afraid of his own wanting. Only Grace ate quiet, Mabel noticed. You found the water and you're the only one not celebrating. I found dampness, Mrs. Mabel. Dampness is a promise. Water is delivery. She looked at her plate. And I've seen plenty of promises that never delivered. I'll celebrate when the bucket comes up full. You've got a suspicious heart, Doctor. I've got a taut heart. Similar thing, hurts different. On the 7th day, the well went dry, not slowly, all at once. The dampness stopped in a thin, stingy layer, and below it came live, rock-hard, dry as bone. The hand drill sparked and wouldn't bite. They forced it down another yard with a sledgehammer. Nothing. Another 1.5 feet. Nothing. Grace climbed down herself, stayed below for 2 hours, and when she came up, her face carried something nobody there had seen on her yet. Doubt. I don't understand, she said quietly, more to herself than the others flipping through the notebook with fingers too quick. The signs were all here. The plant, the fold, the crossing lines, it was all right. But the water isn't, said a voice behind her, Wade. He'd walked down the slope and was looking into the dry hole, and his face was working through something complicated, because part of him wanted to be right, and another part, a part he didn't even know he had, badly wanted to be wrong. A week of work, he said. 4 men pulled off other jobs. Tell me what I had spare for that. He kicked a small rock into the hole, and it fell with a dry sound at the bottom. You asked me for till the end of the month, Doctor. Spent half of it digging a grave. I got the spot wrong, Wade, she said. I didn't get the water wrong. Same thing, isn't it? His voice rose for the first time since she'd arrived, and the echo carried down the hillside. He stepped closer, his face red. "Getting the spot wrong is being off by yards. The water's in this ridge, Wade. I know it's there." "How do you know? How exactly does a lady know that—" He took another step. "Because some dead water witcher's old notebook says so? Is that what I bet my ranch on, written prayers?" The silence after that was ugly. The hands looked at the ground. Grace went very quiet, the leather notebook clutched to her chest, and whoever stood close enough would have seen her knuckles white against the leather. "Tomorrow I start over," she said finally low. "I'll redo the measurements." "Tomorrow," Wade said, already climbing the slope, "I'm going to town to talk to the bank. Do what a broke man does. Reality, doctor. Call it reality." And that night reality, which always seems to choose the moment to step on somebody already down, sent more news. Mabel answered the landline, the only phone on the place that still worked, and came to fetch Wade with a face gone pale. It was Otis, the branch manager at the bank. His voice on the line sounded different, the awkward tone of a man reading somebody else's script. "Wade, I wanted you to hear it from me before it comes in a letter. Your loan, it's not with the bank anymore. Sold, practically. An investor bought the note, your whole contract in it. It's legal. It's in the paperwork you signed. The bank's allowed to sell the debt." A long pause. "Wade, the man who holds your ranch's debt now is Nathaniel Cross's group, and his lawyers already filed for foreclosure. They asked for priority. You'll be served this week. After that notice, if it's not paid off in full, the ranch goes to auction. And the deadline they asked for was the shortest the law allows." Wade hung up the phone slowly, sat down in the dark living room and stared at his own hands. His whole life, he'd been the man who laughed loudest, the owner of the porch, the whiskey, the joke. And now he understood with a cold clarity that ached in his bones that the whole time there had been a bigger game going on over his head, and in that game, he had never once been a player. Away from the table, Grace appeared in the doorway. She'd heard it all from the kitchen. "He bought your debt," she said. It wasn't a question. "Bought it." Wade gave a small, broken laugh, nothing inside it. "You were right, Doctor. He was in a hurry. Got tired of waiting on me to take the hand out and decided to just take it outright. Must have cost him plenty buying up rotten paper on dry land." He looked up at her. "Unless the land isn't dry. Is that what you're about to tell me now?" "That's what I've been trying to tell you since the first day." "Then why is your well empty, Grace?" It was the first time he'd called her by name, and the question had no mockery in it, just desperation, which is a far worse thing to hear. Grace crossed the room and sat down across from him. "Because I got in a hurry and let my pride get ahead of me." She set the leather notebook on the table between them. "I've got a note in this book I read and chose to ignore because my own measurement said something different, and I wanted to prove the student knew better than the teacher. The spot I picked was the spot my math gave me. His spot's different. Higher, harder, in a place that's going to be a lot more work." "And what does the note say?" Grace opened the notebook to a page marked with a scrap of twine and turned it toward Wade. On the yellowed paper, in Water Sam's small handwriting, it said, "Beside the drawing of a ridge with a slab up top, where the rock has writing, the water has a door. Don't dig in front of her house. Dig at her back." "Rock with writing," Wade murmured. "What writing?" "That's what I'm going to find out, tomorrow before sunup." Grace closed the notebook and stood. "Mr. Wade, answer me one thing and answer it true. How much time do we really have before this ranch goes to auction?" He did the math he'd already done 10 times in the dark. If Nathaniel's lawyer moves the way he knows how to move, 3 weeks. Maybe less. Grace nodded slowly and stopped at the door. "Then tomorrow nobody tends cattle, nobody fixes fence, and nobody asks me if I'm sure. Tomorrow, this whole ranch is coming up that ridge with me." What neither of them knew that night of defeat was that the rock with writing was real, that it had been there longer than any fence, any deed, any family name in that county, and that its secret wasn't going to change only the fate of Lucky Star Ranch. It was going to dig up a story that certain people had spent a great deal of money trying to keep buried. That early morning, long before the rooster, Grace woke and couldn't fall back asleep. She slipped out of the bunkhouse without a sound, crossed the yard in the blue dark, and sat down on the steps of the old barn. Alone, the leather notebook in her lap. The whole West Texas sky spread out overhead, that absurd sky, full of stars the city had stolen from her for 20 years. She opened to the first page. The land talks. Folks just forgot how to listen. And there in the dark, with nobody to see, Grace Whitfield finally let her face come apart. She thought about her father, Sam Water. Sam lean, sun-cured, coming back from his travels with the notebook tucked in his shirt and the smell of tobacco and distance on him. She was a girl waiting for him at the gate of the rented house, and he always brought her a pretty rock from his pocket and said the same thing every time. "Found water, sweetheart. Folks out there have got water now." The way other fathers said they'd sold something, bought something, made a profit, her father said the folks had water now. That was his measure of a life well spent for the day. She thought of the shame she'd felt about him as a teenager, her father, no diploma, tasting dirt on his tongue in front of her college friends. Thought of the fury with which she'd studied like somebody running away the scholarship she'd won college, in the city her name in print, her first technical report. Grace Whitfield, P.E. She mailed him a copy. He mailed back inside the envelope a dried leaf from the hackberry tree, the plant that promises water, and a note in crooked handwriting, "Always knew you were a deep well." She thought about the day he died, years back, quiet and without fuss, the way he'd lived in a hammock at the end of a trip. He left her his bedroll, his machete, and the notebook. She put it in a drawer in her apartment and never opened it. It hurt too much. It sat there 7 years in the dark, waiting the way water waits. And then she thought about what she didn't want to think about. The fall. The company was called Continental Hydro Corp., big, respected holding half the major water projects in the country. Grace was the best field engineer they had, and everybody knew it. 15 years with the firm, an office with her name on the door, and a director, Dr. Voss, who smiled the way a man bites. The project was enormous. A groundwater study to clear the way for a giant development in a region where Grace, after measuring, had concluded the opposite of what the client wanted to hear. The aquifer couldn't handle that kind of extraction. Within 10 years, every well in the surrounding population would run dry. She wrote it in the report, with the numbers, the maps, and her signature. Dr. Voss called her into his office on a Friday night, praised the work, said there were just some formatting adjustments, matters of wording. The client was sensitive to certain terms. He put the revised version in front of her, dozens of pages, the deadline already blown, her flight leaving before dawn for another job site, and the pen. "It's just your formatting, Grace. The content's still yours, trust me." She was exhausted. She trusted him. She signed without reading. The published report said the opposite of what she'd measured. The numbers were doctored, the conclusions flipped, and underneath all of it, guaranteeing all of it, her signature. When the development went through, and the town's first wells started failing much sooner than even she'd predicted, they went looking for somebody technical to blame, and there was a perfect name in a perfect report. She tried to report it showed the drafts, the original measurements. The company produced the signed document. One employee's word against $1 billion contract. The disciplinary process was fast and polite like an execution. She lost her license. For years, lost her job, lost her name. The trade papers wrote, "The engineer behind the fraudulent report," and the phone stopped ringing. Forever. Her husband stuck it out a year of closed doors and then left. She didn't blame him for it anymore. The apartment went to pay lawyers. And on some ordinary afternoon, stripped down to nothing, Grace opened the drawer she hadn't opened in 7 years and took out the leather notebook. The land talks. Folks just forgot how to listen. She sold what was left, laced up her old field boots, and went out into dry country to do the one thing nobody could take from her, with a signature walk look. Find water for people who didn't have any for free. Ranch to ranch, town to town, sleeping wherever they'd let her. She'd been doing it almost 2 years when the road spat her out, thirsty, at the gate of Lucky Star. The rooster crowed, far off, the sky lightened at the edge. Grace wiped her face with the back of her hand, took a deep breath, and opened to the page with the twine. Don't dig in front of her house. Dig at her back. All right, Daddy, she said quietly to the empty yard. This time I'll listen to you first. She climbed the ridge alone, with the first light, straight for the big slab where, weeks earlier, she'd heard the sound with the basement in it. The rock was cold from the night. Grace walked around it slowly, once, twice, looking from every angle, and nothing. Smooth rock, gray, ordinary. Where's your writing? She murmured. That's when the sun finished coming up. The light came in low, almost lying flat, skimming the surface of the slab, at an angle that only exists for a few minutes of the day, and the rock answered. Under the raking light, the smooth surface filled with fine shadows, lines, spirals, rows of dots, drawings of open hands, and running through all of it, repeated, insistent, a symbol seen at ancient sites all across the Southwest, the long zigzag that archaeologists call the water line. The mark ancient peoples, long before any ranch existed, used to mark the places of permanent water. Rock art carved and painted there thousands of years ago, worn invisible to the ordinary eye, alive in the raking light for anybody who knew the right hour to look. Grace's breath caught. The ancient peoples didn't mark rainwater. They didn't waste sacred rock on water that came and went. They marked water that never failed, the kind that outlasted centuries of drought. If that symbol was there, it was because on that ridge, within reach of those people, there had once been permanent water. And permanent water in that kind of rock formation only has one explanation. A deep reservoir, large, protected, that holds up against any drought. Don't dig in front of her house, she recited, her voice shaking. Dig at her back. In front of the house, the painted slab, the sacred place, the door. At her back, the far side of the ridge. Grace circled the ridge at a run, stumbling on loose rock until she reached the far side of the fold, and there, on the reverse slope, she stopped. Now she saw with her father's eyes and her own together for the first time. The gentle dip in the ground, the different colored grass running in a long streak, the 3 cottonwoods lined up like sentries, the giant anthill, all of it aligned, all of it pointing, all of it shouting, what had always been there, written in a language folks had forgotten how to read. She opened the leather notebook with her dirt-stained hands and wrote below her father's writing, "Found the door. Sorry it took so long." When she came down off the ridge, the sun was already high, and Grace Whitfield came down like somebody whose feet weren't touching the ground. Halfway there, she met the whole ranch heading up the other way. Wade out front in the hat and work boots nobody had seen on him in years. Frank, Danny the hands. Mabel bringing up the rear in her kitchen dress hoe over her shoulder, because she wasn't about to be left out, not if the Lord himself commanded it. "You said the whole ranch was coming up today," Wade called out from a distance, half sheepish, shrugging. "So, the ranch came up." Grace stopped on the trail, looking at that procession of stubborn people, and laughed. Really laughed. Loud. For the first time in years. "Then come on," she called back. "Come on, I want to introduce y'all to a very old lady." They dug at the back of the ridge for 9 days. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't easy. Loose rock that slid, bracing rebuilt, twice, Danny wrenching his wrist, sun that split you open, and nights of cold wind. Mabel climbing the ridge twice a day with food and coffee on a borrowed mule. Grace mapped every foot of the work, checked every brace, climbed down herself on the dangerous stretches, and it was different from the first well, from the start. Everybody felt it. On the third day, the dirt came up dark. On the fifth, cold enough to bite the hand. On the seventh, cracks appeared in the rock, and out of the cracks rose a damp breath, an old basement kind of breath, and the hands looked at each other without saying anything because nobody wanted to ruin it with words. On those nights of digging, they camped right there on the ridge to save the time of the road. Built a small fire between the rocks, warmed coffee, and the hands told stories, which is the way of dry country, to pray without admitting it. They told about Frank's grandfather, who swore he'd heard the ridge groan on a moonlit night. Told about the fire snake that guarded treasure in the writing rock, and Danny swore that if the snake showed up, he'd split the treasure with it fair and square so long as it left the water. Grace listened to it all, quietly wrapped in a blanket, watching the coals. "You don't believe in that stuff, do you, Doctor?" Danny asked one night. "You're a science person." "I'm a science person," Grace said, "but I'll tell you something science taught me that a lot of science people forget. Every old story that survives because it's carrying a truth inside it, even if it's wrapped up in something else. The old folks said the ridge groaned, said the writing rock guarded treasure. Then I come along with my instruments and find out that the ridge really does hold something, that the writing rock really does mark something." She tossed a stick on the fire. "Your grandfather's story and my chart are talking about the same lady, Danny. Just a different accent." Nobody said anything for a while. The fire crackled, and Frank from the dark summed it up for the whole ranch. "Then we're in good company on this job." On the morning of the 9th day, Frank was down below working the rock with an iron bar when the stone gave way, different. The bar sank all at once, nearly taking him with it, and out of the opening that appeared came a sound. A sound from far off, deep, continuous, impossible, the sound of running water. Frank climbed the rope like a spooked colt, eyes wide, and couldn't say a word, just pointed down. And Grace climbed down, and the silence up top lasted a lifetime, everybody leaning over the mouth of the well, until her voice came up from the depths, broken, echoing off the rock. "She's here. She's big. She's real big." What happened next at the mouth of that well didn't fit into words. Ranch hands danced with ranch hands. Danny cried without any shame at all, wrapped wrist and everything. Mabel sat on a rock and laughed and cried at the same time, saying, "Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy," which was her whole prayer for every occasion. And Wade Coleman stood still frozen, looking at the dark hole in the ground of the ranch where he'd been born. And when Grace climbed out, mud to her soul, he walked up to her, opened his mouth, found nothing in there worth saying, and did what a man like that does once in a lifetime. He took off his hat and bowed his head. "Don't thank me yet," Grace said, breathless but with a fierce shine in her eyes. "Water you hear isn't water you've measured. I need to know how much there is at what depth, how steady, and how much can be pulled without killing it. I need real equipment. And I know where to rent it, but it costs. And most of all, Mr. Wade, I need nobody, not here, not in sundown, to breathe a word of what we found. Not one, not at the bar, not at the market, not at church. If Nathaniel finds out before we file everything, he'll push that auction up in a way nobody can stop." It was Mabel who solved the money problem that same night in the kitchen, dumping onto the table a feed tin full of folded bills. The savings of a lifetime. "Mabel, I can't take this," Wade said, choked up. "It's not for you, man. It's for the ranch. I was born in this kitchen." She pushed the tin forward. "And the doctor's gonna pay me back with interest." "Aren't you, doctor? With interest and an artesian well right at my kitchen door." "There it is," Grace said. "Deal. Now everybody clear out, 'cause tomorrow's an early one and this kitchen's closing." Grace traveled 2 days with the money. Came back hitching a ride on a truck hauling crates of rented equipment from a former college classmate, one of the few who still took her calls, and spent a week doing with Danny as her fascinated assistant what she called geophysics. Lines of electrodes staked into the ground, cables a little machine spitting out numbers, charts, sketched at night on the kitchen table under everybody's watch like she was some kind of fortune teller of the rock. At the end of the week, she gathered Wade, Mabel, and Frank in the ranch house living room, shut the door, and spread a map on the table, drawn and colored by her own hand. I'll say it the technical way first, then I'll translate. The ridge holds a zone of interconnected fractures over a wide area, recharged by rain that soaks in up top, sealed by hard layers that kept it from draining out. A deep reservoir protected from evaporation that's been building up for a long time. Translate, Mabel said. Grace laid her palm flat on the drawing of the ridge. Underneath this ranch, there's enough water to irrigate every foot of this land, fill the pond water, a herd 10 times bigger than the biggest this ranch ever had, and still have enough left over for decades, even if it doesn't rain another drop for years. This isn't a dry ranch with a well anymore, Mr. Wade. This is one of the most valuable pieces of land in the whole county that's spent its whole life dressed up as a desert. The silence in the room had physical weight. "How much?" Wade asked quietly. "How much is it worth? Bare, dry land worth like this? Not much. Land with this water underneath it, documented with water rights filed, worth many times more. Many." Grace looked at him. "Enough to pay off your debt 10 times over and leave a fortune besides." She reached into the folder where she kept her charts and pulled out a loose sheet protected in plastic. "That's why I wanted to measure before we celebrated. And that's why I need to tell you the bad part now." She set the sheet on the table. "When I went to return the equipment, my old classmate told me something. Years back, the company he worked for got an offer to do a geophysical survey of this region. Private job, confidential, paid under the table. He didn't take the job, but he kept the material he'd received with the bid. Gave me a copy." She set the sheet on the table. It was a map of the region, with a study boundary drawn on it. The boundary covered the whole Lucky Star Ridge and the neighboring properties. The survey ended up being done by another company, quietly, no fanfare, under the cover of a mineral survey. And the results never showed up anywhere. Which doesn't make sense because a negative result doesn't need secrecy. Only a positive study gets hidden. "Who paid for the study?" Frank asked. "On paper, a shell company. But look at the stamp of who did the field work." Wade pulled the sheet closer. In the corner, a smudged blue stamp read Continental Hydro Corp. To him, the name meant nothing, but Grace had gone very quiet. "You know that company," Mabel said, reading her better than she read letters. She'd seen the doctor's hand close hard on the edge of the table. "I worked there 15 years. Grace took a breath. "It's the company that destroyed my name. And the man who signed off on the confidential jobs there, the jobs that never make it to a public report, was the same man who falsified my study, Dr. Voss." She flipped the sheet over. On the back, in the contact list for the shell company between numbers and addresses, a managing partner's name, Nathaniel Cross. The whole room took a while to breathe. "Then he knows," Wade said, his voice coming out rough. "He's known for years. He knew when he sat on my porch and called me a friend. Knew when he offered a third of the value. Knew when he bought my debt." He stood up slowly, and something in his face had turned to stone. "He watched my ranch die of thirst, knowing the whole time it was lying on top of an ocean." "He and Voss bought the other ranches in that boundary line the same way," Grace said. "Earl's the Parker brothers, all sitting on the same water." They've been quietly putting together the biggest irrigated land project in the county, paying dead land prices, just waiting on the last piece. She set her finger on the map over Lucky Star. "The middle piece, the best of all. Yours." "And the auction is the hand closing," Frank finished. The auction is in 11 days, Wade said. Process server came by yesterday. Everybody looked at Grace, and Grace looked at the leather notebook on the table beside the map, its leather worn smooth by 2 generations of stubborn hands. Then we've got 11 days to do 2 things, she said. Prove what's under this ground, with paperwork nobody can knock down, and prove what's inside these 2 men, with paperwork nobody can bury. She closed her hand over the notebook. I spent years running from that company, that man, that name. Running's over. This time, they're the ones who dug the subject back up. What Nathaniel Cross didn't know yet, picking out a tie in sundown for auction day, was that the drifter with the little notebook he'd sneered at on the porch was exactly the person his whole scheme had chewed up and spit out years earlier. The one person in the whole country who could recognize that stamp, understand that map, and know from the inside exactly how that machine worked. Some errors a man makes out of meanness, and some errors a man makes from never looking at the face of who he's humiliating. Nathaniel had made both on the same day, on the same porch. It was Frank who spotted the man in the ball cap first. He was fixing the front fence when he noticed a motorcycle parked in the shade across the road, too far for a greeting, too close for coincidence. The man smoked and watched the ranch, stayed an hour left, came back the next day. We're being watched, Frank reported that night in the kitchen. I know, Grace said. He was at the market the Saturday Wade told the story about the bet. Mabel described him without knowing she was describing him. Thin man, ball cap, soda payphone. He's Nathaniel's scout. What do we do? Nothing. A scout who runs off spooks the boss. A scout left alone becomes a tool. Grace poured coffee for everybody. Starting tomorrow, he's going to see exactly what we need him to see. He's going to see the drill rig working on the front slope, on the spot of my first well. The dry well. We'll kick up dust there, put people to work there, string up tarps there. Let him tell his boss the crazy doctor is spending her last chips digging in the same wrong spot. And the real well? The real one works at night, at the back of the ridge, out of sight of the road. That's why I had the access opened up the back way, along the dry creek bed. She looked around the table at the hands. It's going to be hard. Day shift on the fake dig. Graveyard shift on the real work. Anybody who can't keep it up, nobody's judging. Nobody quit. And there was even a strange, almost childish pleasure in that made-up war. Danny discovered a talent for acting. He'd spend the day on the front slope hollering pointless orders, pointing down, making worried faces for the road. The scout took notes on all of it. In sundown, Nathaniel got the reports and laughed with Dr. Voss on the phone. They're digging the same dry hole, Voss. The woman's stone crazy. This'll be over on its own before the auction. Meanwhile, in the small hours at the back of the ridge under a rigged-up spotlight, the real rig bored foot by foot down through the rock toward the ancient water, and Grace checked every sample, logging everything by the light of the tractor's headlamp. In the middle of that week, Grace asked Wade for something he wasn't expecting. I need you to take me out to Earl's place, and then the Parkers. What for? Earl hasn't spoken to me since he lost his land. Figures I should have helped him back then. And maybe I should have. That's exactly why you're coming along. Some debts you pay with money, and some you pay by showing up. Earl was living now in a borrowed lot on the edge of town, growing what he could in ground that wasn't his. He met the 2 of them standing in the doorway, not inviting them in, arms crossed, his face set in the kind of coldness a man practices a long time. Come to see how a man looks after Nathaniel Cross gets through with him. Came to show you why he got through, Grace said. She spread the map on the fence rail. She explained everything, the boundary, the hidden study, the water under the ranch that had been his, the same ridge. She showed him where his old house had stood on the drawing, right over one of the marked zones. Earl stood a long time looking at the map. When he raised his head, his eyes were wet, and his voice was low and shaking with old anger, finally finding the right address for it. My wife carried water buckets on her head the last 2 years we lived out there. Half an hour's walk to the neighbor's stock tank. Came back with a bad back and shame on her face. He tapped a finger on the map. The water was right under her bedroom. Is, and he knew. What do you need from me? Your memory and your signature. Everything you remember about the sale, the pressure, the promises, who showed up, what they said, prices, dates. The prosecutor needs to show a pattern. 1 case is bad luck. 2 is a coincidence. That whole boundary line is a racket. The Parker brothers were easier. They already hated Nathaniel openly and just needed a place to hang it. The oldest one listened to the whole explanation quietly and at the end asked just one thing. This auction of Wade's ranch, is anybody going to be watching? The whole courthouse probably. The whole town won't miss it. Good. Old man Parker straightened his hat. 'Cause I want a front row seat looking him dead in the eye when this blows up. Me and everybody he ever called a friend on his way to buying him out cheap. On the drive back to the ranch that night, in the cab of the old truck, Wade drove a long stretch in silence. Then he spoke, eyes still on the road. Earl asked me for help back then. Came up on my porch, same as you did. Asked for a loan to hold the ranch 1 more year. A pause. I had the money at the time. I still had it. Said no. Figured his trouble wasn't my trouble, and even made a joke about his bad luck at the feed store afterward. Grace said nothing. Let the silence work. Then the drought showed up on my doorstep too, Wade went on, and I found out no porch is high enough. The only difference between me and Earl was the order we got in line. And what are you going to do with what you found out, Wade thought. The dirt road ran dark in the headlights. If this water's what you say it is, I want it reaching Earl's land too. The Parkers. Whoever else is sitting on top of it. Don't know how that's done. Sold shared government gets involved, but you know. You did projects like this. I did. Then do it again. Put it on paper. This project Nathaniel wanted to run in secret to get rich alone. We do it out in the open. He glanced at her quick, then back to the road, almost embarrassed. Once in my life, beat Nathaniel Cross to a good idea. That alone was worth the trip. Grace looked out the window so he wouldn't see her smile. Outside, the dark shape of the ridge slid by against the stars guarding its ancient lady. And she thought her father had been right about one more thing he always said. Water, when it finds a way out, doesn't rise alone. It brings people with it. The 11 days that followed were the most intense Lucky Star Ranch had lived through in 100 years. Grace slept 4 hours a night. Daytime she ran the drilling of the real well now, with a proper rig rented in a hurry with her classmates' help, who, hearing the whole story on the phone, went quiet a long minute, and then said only, I always knew that report wasn't yours. Tell me what you need. At night, she wrote the full technical report the only way she knew how. Maps, cross-sections, numbers, everything, airtight everything, protected, filed the water rights application, the discovery registration, and a separate folder she assembled with the care of somebody defusing a bomb. The blue stamp folder. Her classmate sent more than equipment. He sent names. A young county prosecutor who'd spent months collecting scattered complaints about suspicious land purchases. A journalist who'd written about the wells that went dry in the old scandal and never swallowed the official story. A retired records clerk from the state water board who'd kept a copy of everything that crossed his desk in 30 years out of pure stubbornness and distrust. Thread by thread, the net was woven in silence. Meanwhile, in sundown, Nathaniel Cross had lunch with the auctioneer and sent the black truck to get washed. On the 6th day, the rig hit the main zone at the depth Grace had predicted, within a few feet. The water column rose in the pipe with a force that made the veteran driller pull off his cap and say that in 40 years on the job he'd never seen a flow like that out of rock like that. Nobody set off fireworks, doctor's orders. The water was capped, sealed, and logged, quiet as a secret keeping itself. On the 9th day, what Grace expected to happen happened. Somebody talked. Maybe a hand at the bar, Maybe the gas station owner where the rig truck fueled up. Dry country doesn't keep a secret that size. The news reached the wrong ears, and that night the phone at the ranch house rang. "Ms. Grace Whitfield," said the smooth voice on the other end. "Or should I say the engineer of the fraudulent report?" "Dr. Voss," she answered, calm-waving Wade over to listen in. "How long's it been? Still signing off on other people's work?" "I'll be brief since I value your time, something I imagine life out in the country has taught you to appreciate. We know what you've found, we know what you're filing, and you know better than anybody what we're capable of doing to a technician's reputation, especially a repeat offender." His pause was polite as a knife, but nobody here holds a grudge. Mr. Cross is prepared to offer a generous settlement. Withdraw the filings, hand over the material, and you walk away with enough money to start fresh anywhere in the world you like, and your license restored. We do have pull for that, you know. Wade went white with anger beside her. Grace shook her head, calm, and spoke slowly, choosing every word. "Dr. Voss, you're offering me money and my license back to hide a water study. Again. Except this time you're offering it to me over the phone on a line you don't know in a house you've never seen." The silence on the other end lasted a beat too long. "Good night, Doctor." The line went dead. Wade exploded. "She hung up! That worm hung up! And tomorrow he'll wake up scheming some way to tear down your filings." "He will, Wade," Grace said. And for the first time in 11 days, she smiled with no tiredness in it at all. "But you didn't understand what just happened, Mr. Wade. Years ago, these men destroyed my life with one piece of evidence, my signature on their paper, my word against a document. I lost." She lifted a small recorder borrowed from the retired clerk, still spinning wired into the line since the first ring. "Tonight, Dr. Voss just returned the favor." Auction day dawned clear, without a cloud, same as every day for the last 3 years. The proceeding was set for the courthouse in sundown at 10 in the morning. Since early that morning the town had been buzzing. A ranch going to auction was a show, and the fall of the Coleman family, after 3 generations of porch and loud laughter, was the show of the year. Nathaniel Cross arrived at 9:30 in a light-colored suit, shaking hands on the courthouse steps like a politician the day before an election. Dr. Voss had come in from the city and waited discreetly in the back of the room, sunglasses on. Their lawyer went over the paperwork. Everything set, everything bought, everything in place. At 10:05, Lucky Star Ranch walked into the room. Walked in whole. Wade out front in his father's old suit pressed by Mabel the night before, Grace beside him in clean work pants and a white shirt, the leather notebook tucked under her arm, same as always. Behind them, Frank, Danny, with his wrists still wrapped the hands, with their hats in their fists, Mabel in her Sunday dress. And behind them, to the shock of the room, came others. Earl, who'd lost his ranch to Nathaniel years before. The Parker brothers. Whole families whose land had been sold off cheap, all of them warned thread by thread over the previous week. The murmuring grew. Nathaniel looked at all of it and for the first time straightened his tie for no reason at all. Silence. The auctioneer stepped up to the table, paperwork. The gavel set down his voice opening the proceeding, reading the notice, the description of the property, Lucky Star Ranch, so many acres, improvements, the debt in default, the yard, the cistern, the bucket sinking, the writing rock lit by the rising sun. Her father's voice. "Folks out there have got water now." "Before bidding begins," said a firm voice from the doorway, "the district attorney's office requests the floor." The young prosecutor crossed the center aisle carrying a thick folder flanked by 2 officers, and the whole room turned as one neck to look. "This court receives at this time a request to suspend the auction and a copy of an ongoing investigation." He handed the documents to the bench. There is substantial evidence that this debt's foreclosure is part of a fraudulent land acquisition scheme built on the deliberate concealment of essential information about the value of these properties, using a shell company and involving Mr. Nathaniel Cross and the engineer present in this room, known as Dr. Voss. The room exploded. The auctioneer banged the gavel, calling for order. Nathaniel's lawyer stood, shouting about procedure, and the prosecutor calmly laid piece after piece on the table. The pieces Grace and the network had stitched together in 11 days. The map of the secret boundary line with the blue Continental Hydrocorp stamp. The shell company contract with Nathaniel's name on the back. The matching dates the secret survey, first the ranch purchases, after one by one all inside the boundary, all at dead land prices. The new technical report on Lucky Star, signed by an engineer whose license had been restored in an emergency proceeding the day before, proving the reserve of water the buyers had always known was there. The written statement of the retired records clerk. The journalist's story, already published that morning in the state paper, already spreading across the country. And last, a recording. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "an offer made 2 days ago to the engineer responsible, proposing money and reinstatement of her professional license in exchange for concealing a water study. The caller identifies himself and references word for word a prior case." At the back of the room, Dr. Voss took off his sunglasses with the slow hand of a man who'd aged 10 years in 10 seconds. Nathaniel Cross stood, his mouth opening and closing, scanning the room for a friendly face, and finding row after row the faces of every family he'd ever called a friend on his way to buying them out cheap. The auction was suspended, the foreclosure frozen. The two men were escorted out of the courthouse to give statements, crossing the same steps where an hour earlier Nathaniel had been shaking hands, now under the heavy silence of the whole town and the click of the journalist's camera. At the courthouse door, Wade Coleman stood still, stunned, watching the movement like a man stepping out of a whirlwind. Then he turned to Grace, calm in the middle of the chaos. "Is it over?" he asked. "No," Grace said. "Now it starts. You've got a ranch to run, and I've got half of it." And it was there, on the courthouse steps in sundown, in front of the town that had spent years laughing at his bad luck, that Wade Coleman laughed again. But it was a new laugh, washed clean, one he didn't even recognize himself. And with it finally came what had been stuck in his throat for weeks. "Dr. Grace, forgive me. For the first day, for the butcher paper, for every little jab." He held out his hand. "And thank you for knocking on the right stranger's gate." Grace shook his hand hard, like a partner. "You got just about everything wrong, Mr. Wade, except the name of the ranch." The water rose to the sky over Lucky Star on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the auction that never happened. It didn't have to rise. Grace had explained a dozen times that a well like that gets fitted with a pump controlled with a valve treated with respect. But there was one moment during the finishing work, one necessary technical moment, when the pressure down below got to speak without a translator, and the water column shot up above the tripod, tall, thick, absurd opening, a white fan in the dry desert air that the wind scattered into a fine spray. And wherever that spray touched ground, the dust turned to the smell of rain. The whole ranch was there. Nobody worked that morning. Danny ran under the spray clothes and all hollering. Behind him went the hands, and then Mabel in her house slippers, laughing that laugh of hers that was half church, half county fair. Old man Parker, who'd come to see it with his own eyes, took off his hat and let the water hit his white head, standing still, eyes closed, like a man taking a blessing. Earl arrived later, quiet, stood off a while, watching. Then he walked to the edge of the wet ground, crouched, pressed his palm into the new mud, and stayed like that a long minute, head down. Nobody interrupted. There are thirsts of the body and thirsts of something else, and that morning, Lucky Star killed both. Wade Coleman didn't go into the water. He stood near Grace, a little apart from the celebration, both of them wet only from the spray. And when he finally managed to speak, his voice came out strange. My daddy died thinking this land was cursed. My grandfather died mad at it. 3 generations cussing the ground. He swallowed hard. And the ground this whole time holding this for us, waiting for somebody who knew how to ask. You don't ask, Mr. Wade, Grace said, watching the water fan draw a short rainbow in the air. You listen. You said the right word yourself at the courthouse without even realizing it. The gate. Your whole life you thought you were the owner of the gate. Nobody is. Best you can be is the gatekeeper. The land was open, Wade said low, shaking his head. It was me that was shut. You talk just like that notebook. That's the biggest compliment I've gotten on this ranch. In the months that followed, Lucky Star became a working project and work became a life. The main well was fitted, permitted, tied into a pipeline that Grace redesigned from memory with the almost physical pleasure of putting 15 years of career to use again. The dead stock pond was cleared, sealed, where it needed sealing, and became a mirror again. When it filled for the first time, egrets showed up the second day. Nobody knew where from. Mabel declared that an egret is God's signature on a receipt for water delivered. The pasture got replanted in strips with drought-tough grass, watered by sprinklers the hands learned to set up and repair themselves. The skinny cattle fattened up and got company. Wade slowly bought back a herd with new judgment listening before he signed, comparing before he bought. And every time his hand itched to make a snap decision, he remembered the butcher paper and took a breath. Mabel got her well right at the kitchen door as promised, with its own pump and a sign Danny had made in town without telling anybody. Mabel's spring founding partner. She argued, said it was foolish, told him to take it down. The sign's still there today, and she dusts it off every week. The tin money came back, with the agreed interest and an extra amount Wade insisted on. Mabel took a lot of convincing. And the next Sunday, the little church in Sundown woke up with a new roof, and nobody claimed credit. But the preacher thanked out loud the congregant everybody knew looking straight at the pew where Mabel sat pretending to pray with her eyes shut. The butcher paper came out of the china cabinet and went to a proper notary's office. Wade insisted on carrying the original himself. Smoothed out, kept in a plastic sleeve, and the clerk laughed when she saw it, and Wade said she could laugh. But that scrap of meat counter paper had been the best contract he'd ever signed in his life, and the only one he'd signed like a fool and honored like a smart man. The deed registered what the porch had promised. Half of Lucky Star Ranch in Grace Whitfield's name. Grace tried to turn it down just once. Mr. Wade, that was mockery. You signed that to humiliate me in front of your men. Doesn't count the intention, Wade answered. The intention was garbage. That's exactly why I'm not paying the intention. I'm paying the word. It's the only thing left of the man I used to be, and I mean for it to count for something. He slid the pen across the notary's table. Sign it, Doctor. Read it first this time, since I know you like to. It was the only time anybody ever saw Grace Whitfield cry in public. It didn't last long. She read it, page by page, every line in the respectful hush of the whole office, and signed. And the scheme with the shell company boundary that collapsed the way things built in the dark collapse when somebody switches on the light. The investigation the young prosecutor opened on auction day got back up from the state, turned into an operation with a name and headlines. The shell company was unwound piece by piece. The purchases of every ranch inside that boundary got reviewed one by one, with statements from Earl the Parkers and others who found their courage after them. The hidden geophysical study was located, seized, and confirmed with years-old numbers, everything Grace had proven all over again with her own 2 hands. Nathaniel Cross lost in order his allies, his contracts, the ranches bought through the scheme which became the target of suits to undo the deals, and finally, the freedom to walk through sundown with his head held high, which, of all his possessions, was the one he'd valued most. The case wound its slow way through the courts, expensive lawyers fighting over every comma. But some sentences a town hands down before the law does, and there's no appeal from the town's sentence. The feed store, where he used to shake hands, started serving him in silence. The bar table where he used to brag about deals never had a chair pulled out for him again. As for Dr. Voss, the recording did its work. Combined with the boundary line documents, it reopened a case nobody expected reopened. Grace's old case. The journalist wrote the whole series. The story of the engineer who signed without reading of the report swapped out on a Friday night of the town wells that failed exactly as she'd predicted, of her name used first as a shield and then as garbage. The original drafts Grace had kept all those years that nobody had wanted to look at back then went to review. They matched line for line with what reality had done afterward. The truth, which is a heavy sleeper, woke up almost a decade late and in a bad mood. But it woke up. The state licensing board reviewed her case in a packed session. Grace didn't go. She was calibrating a pump on Earl's place that day. Said marked land can't wait on paperwork, and sent her old classmate to stand in for her. The decision came back unanimous. License fully reinstated, the old case voided, and an official statement of exoneration that her classmate read to her over the phone. That night, sitting on the barn steps with the leather notebook in her lap, she got another call. "They want you to come accept it at some kind of ceremony, Grace. Speeches, all that. What do I tell them?" Grace looked up at the West Texas sky, the same absurd sky under which she'd cried alone on that same step. "Tell them I say thank you, and that whoever wants to honor me can go drill a well in some forgotten place and put whatever name they like on it," she smiled. "Tell them the engineer of the fraudulent report is dead. Whoever answers now is Water Sam's daughter. Lucky Star's first harvest reborn came in at the end of a season nobody forgot. It wasn't big. Grace forbade ambition that first year. Beat-down soil heals like a beat-down person," she said, patient, with no pressure. "Push it, and it breaks again." They planted what the ground could handle. Corn in one field, beans in another, grass for the cattle, and the big garden Mabel annexed to her kitchen empire without asking anybody's permission. But when the first loaded trucks rolled out through the gate, the whole ranch stopped to watch. Frank took off his hat. Somebody honked a horn, and Wade, standing in the middle of the yard, watched the dust from the trucks on the road with a look so undone that Mabel came over to check if he was feeling all right. "I'm fine," he said. "It's just, I never saw that before." "Saw what, man?" "Trucks. Stuff leaving this ranch that wasn't skinny cattle going to pay off debt. Stuff leaving because there was extra." He shook his head slowly. "I'm the age I am, Mabel, and I never once in my life saw extra." The harvest money got its destination decided at a porch meeting, everybody present, because that was another thing that changed with the water. At Lucky Star, big decisions stopped being born fully formed in the owner's head alone. Part of it paid costs and built up reserve at Grace's insistence, because she knew what life does to those who don't save. Another part became better wages and the first profit sharing that crew had ever seen in their lives. Danny framed his pay stub, silly as that was, and hung it on the bunkhouse wall. And a third part, everybody agreed, without argument, went to speed up the pipeline for Earl's place. The day water reached the land that had been Earl's land, the courts returned to him once the deal with Nathaniel got unwound. Called for a celebration that brought together every family from that boundary line. They held it at Earl's old house, patched up in a group effort. When the pump switched on and the first spray rose from the sprinkler, Earl's wife, the one who'd carried water on her head for 2 years, walked under it in her dress, laughing and crying, and the whole party went in after her. Earl stood at the edge, holding his cap, not brave enough to walk in until she came and pulled him by the hand. Wade watched from a distance with Grace. "Should have been years ago," he said quietly. "If I'd loaned that money, it should have." Grace agreed without softening any of it, because that wasn't her way. "You were wrong. There's no water that washes that clean, and you'll carry it. But pay attention to what you're doing now, because that counts too." Folks who were wrong and changed are worth more to this world than folks who were never tested. I know exactly what I'm talking about. Old Man Parker walked up to the two of them with 3 cups and a bottle of homemade plum liqueur. "Wade Coleman," he said, pouring. "I swore to myself I'd never drink with your kind again." "And what changed?" "Your kind." The old man raised his cup. "The water. Took its time, but it never got the address wrong." They drank. And from that night on, what existed between those families stopped being a business partnership and became what dry country does best when you let it: chosen kin. The kind that fights on Monday and eats Sunday dinner together. In time came visitors nobody invited and everybody welcomed. A school bus came from sundown, a shy teacher asking permission at the gate, kids pouring off the old bus hollering. Grace dropped whatever she was doing and spent the morning with them on the Ridge Trail, showing anthills, the plant that promises water, the writing slab lit up in the afternoon light. At the end, a small kid, big-eyed, asked if anybody could learn to listen to the land. "Anybody," Grace said. "But I'll tell you the secret, and pay attention because it's the only one there is. The land doesn't talk louder for anybody, it talks quiet the same for everybody. Whoever learns is whoever keeps coming back to listen." The kid came back first with the school, then on his bike, then alone on Saturdays. Today he knows the name of every plant on that trail, and Grace says when he's not listening that the county's already raised its next one. One afternoon came the journalist from the state paper, this time with no scandal to chase, saying she wanted to write the rest of the story, the part without a villain. She spent 2 days on the ranch, ate in Mabel's kitchen, walked the ridge, filled 3 notebooks. On her way out, already in the car, she asked one last question. "Dr. Whitfield, with your license back and your name clear, you could be at any big project in the country making whatever you wanted. Why stay here?" Grace thought about it. Behind her, the windmill turned, the pond held, its egrets and coffee smell drifted from the kitchen. The smell of home had been for a while now. "I spent 15 years on big projects finding water for other people's numbers. Then life stripped it all away and put me on the road. And walking, I found out what my daddy knew without ever having to break it down. That water has a right size. Water too big turns into a number. Water the size of people turns into a life. I picked my size." She smiled. "Write it your way. But if you can put in that the ranch is called Lucky Star and that the name was right the whole time, it was just waiting." The story ran on a Sunday and traveled across the country. And among the many letters that came in afterward, forwarded by the paper, there was one Grace read twice and kept. It was from her old classmate, the one who'd lent equipment, and his name when nobody else would answer. He wrote that afterward, the old company was drowning in lawsuits and that serious people in the field were talking about starting something new, clean, done right, and that they wanted her at the head of it. He ended with, "You're the only person I know who fell to the bottom of the well and came back up carrying the map." Grace wrote back short by hand on the back of a field sheet. "Thank you from the heart, but I've already got a firm. Headquarters is a porch, the founding partner runs the kitchen, and the other half-owner is learning to listen." Which, believe me, was the hardest piece of engineering of my whole career. When you want to see it for yourself, the gate's open. There's coffee here, there's water, and there's work. Bring boots. The project Wade had asked for in the cab of that truck got a name, paperwork, and a life. Ridge Waters. Grace designed the whole thing this time the right way, from the very first line. Open-filed properly with the State Water Board, involved from day one with a town hall meeting in sundown packed with hats and suspicion that slowly turned into questions and then into a line for signatures. The idea was simple to say and hard to do, which is the recipe for anything worth doing. The reserve under the ridge, used with measure and control, would serve not just Lucky Star, but the neighboring properties sitting on that same water, starting with the families the scheme had knocked down. A shared well here, the pipeline there. Everybody paying what they could, nobody left out for lack of means. Lucky Star, the biggest beneficiary, went in as the biggest investor. Wade signed the contribution without blinking. And when the accountant balked at the size of the number, Wade answered with a line that made its way around town afterward. "Spent my whole life hoarding dry land. Let me try spreading wetland around and see which one pays off better." It paid off fast. The county that had been a case study in drought became a destination for agricultural tours. People came from far off to see the green strips climbing the back slope of the pond, with its egrets, the little pivots turning. And people came above all to see the rock, because the writing slab became exactly what Grace had always said it was: a piece of heritage. She'd notified the archaeologists right after the suspended auction, and they came out from the state university with brushes and patience and confirmed it. Paintings from ancient peoples long before any fence, among them the zigzag waterline repeated pointing. The site got fenced off, with respect marked protected. Wade cleared a proper path to it, and never once charged admission by Rock's own decision. "Whoever wrote it didn't charge me to read it." On a wooden sign at the trailhead, burned in by Frank's own hand, they put up the line Grace chose from the first page of the leather notebook. "The land talks. Folks just forgot how to listen." Danny was the first on the ranch to go back to school. Grace arranged all of it: night classes in town, then a technical certificate, a ride worked out with the milk truck. He complained, said he was too old for a textbook, and she told him she'd known a man who learned to read the land without ever reading a book, and that the problem was never the textbook, it was the excuse. Today, Danny's a licensed ag technician, runs the irrigation for the whole project, and teaches the kids from the neighboring ranches. And when one of them complains it's too hard, he shows them the wrist he wrenched in the well and tells them hard is digging dry. Wet anybody can learn. Frank became the manager of Lucky Star on payroll, with a fair wage and a new little house he helped build himself. Nothing changed about the way he carries himself. Still suspicious, still sees everything first. The difference is now, when he spots a motorcycle parked too long on the road, he laughs to himself and lets it go. Mabel still runs the kitchen because nobody's ever going to move her out of it. But the kitchen now has a working refrigerator, a decent stove, and a faucet she sometimes turns on without needing to. Just a little. Just to listen. Nobody says anything. Everybody understands. And the porch, the famous porch of Lucky Star Ranch, changed its purpose. The 10 o'clock in the morning whiskey ended. The last bottle Wade gave as a gift to the notary on the day of the deed signing, saying it was payment for the most expensive witness in the history of that courthouse. Today the porch has a long table, coffee brewed with Ridgewater, and it's where the two partners settle up at the end of the day. Him with the cattle accounts her with the leather notebook and the project maps, arguing, disagreeing, laughing. The two of them stubborn in a way that makes Mabel shake her head from the kitchen window and grumble that they act like siblings raised together, always fighting. Folks in town asked plenty whether there was something else going on: marriage, romance, the small-minded math folks do to explain a big partnership. Wade always answered the same, and the answer turned into something close to a local saying. "The doctor gave me something rarer than love. Gave me shame in the face of myself. And shame in the face of yourself at my age is a bigger miracle than water out of rock." Grace never answered, just laughed and changed the subject back to flow rate water rights and schedules. But anybody paying attention knows where her heart lives. She still keeps the same plain room she asked for the day half the ranch became hers. The room with the window facing the ridge so she can watch the fold of the hill catch the morning. And everybody knows what she does every Saturday afternoon. Climbs the trail alone with a wildflower or a pretty rock in her pocket, and sits a while in front of the writing slab in silence, the way you visit family. And then, when it was no longer needed, the rain came back. It arrived at the end of a heavy afternoon, announced by a wind that smelled like wet clay, and by Mabel hollering across the yard for nobody to take the wash off the line because this was the real thing. It fell thick and stubborn all night long, drumming on the ranch house roof like a visitor who took too long and shows up apologizing. The whole ranch went out into the yard, of course. A country person doesn't waste a rain even with a full pond already. But it was different from every rain that crew had ever lived through because for the first time, nobody received it like salvation. They received it like family. Nobody did the desperate math of how long it would last, how full it would fill things, how long it would carry them. Life was already secure, guaranteed underground in the dark of the rock with paperwork and water rights filed. Wade stood on the porch, watching the water from the sky mix into ground that now drank from the water below, and said the line Mabel still repeats to this day when she wants to explain everything that happened out there. Look at that. Spent our whole lives on our knees begging the sky, and the answer was in the ground the entire time. Praying's good, doctor, but praying with an artesian well is a whole other kind of prayer. On one of those Saturday afternoons, sometime after everything had settled, Wade climbed up with her for the first time. He stood a little awkward in front of the slab, not sure what a person does in a place like that. Finally, he asked, quiet, "You think your daddy knew that notebook was going to bring you all the way here?" Grace thought about it. The sun was going down, and the low light was starting to light up the old drawings, the long zigzag climbing the rock like a river standing on end. My daddy used to say, no water is ever lost. Said it can spend years trapped in the rock, gone given up for dead, but that as long as it's alive down there, one day it finds a crack, and once it finds one, it rises. She ran her hand slowly along the edge of the slab, where thousands of years before, another hand had drawn the same path. I spent years thinking he was talking about water. They came down together at the end of the day. Below the ranch was lighting its first lamps. The pond held the last of the sun. The mended windmill turned slow in the warm wind, and the steady hum of the sprinklers made over the new pasture the prettiest sound that stretch of country had ever known. The sound of rain scheduled at the courthouse, rain with a set time. Rain that doesn't depend on a prayer anymore. On the porch, Mabel already had the coffee out. On the long table among maps and project papers, the leather notebook lay open to a fresh page where Grace's steady hand had written the survey for the next piece of land to get water. And underneath, the way her father used to do it, a line for whoever came after. Found water. Folks out here have got water now. Wade poured the cups. He looked out at the yard where one day a woman in worn-out boots had shown up asking for a glass of water, where he'd laughed so hard the whiskey sloshed in his glass, and scrawled on a piece of butcher paper out of mockery the one promise that saved his life. "You know what I was going to tell folks that day, if you'd walked off?" he asked. "I was going to tell them at the bar that some crazy woman showed up at my gate wanting half my ranch for water. And what do you tell them today?" Wade raised his cup of coffee, made with ridge water, looked at his partner, looked at the living land as far as the eye could see, and smiled with the new laugh, the washed clean one, the one that doesn't need an audience. "Today I tell them the truth, that a woman showed up at my gate saying she was going to save my ranch. I laughed, and she saved it. The ranch, the neighbor's land, her own good name, and even stubborn old me." Mabel appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, exactly the way she had that very first day. She looked at the two partners at the table, the coffee steaming, the ranch breathing out there in the dark, and before heading back inside, said the last word of the house the way it had always been her right to say it. "See there, Wade? And you wanting to send the girl off with a joke. Learn something. Next time somebody knocks on your gate asking for water, you give them the glass right away. You never know how much she's bringing back." Out there, the night settled whole over the dry country, and underneath it, deep in the generous dark of the rock, the old water kept doing what it always does. Patient, alive, looking for a crack. He laughed at the woman who promised to save his ranch. The land had the last laugh.